This next fly tying tutorial is all about the anatomy of a trout fly and the proportions that I like to try and stick to when I come to put a fly together. If you're a beginner fly tyer, I do think it is very important for you to also understand the anatomy of a hook. So what I've done is I've put this together where you can take a screenshot of this and you can refer to it as we progress through any other tutorials moving down the line. You've got this as a point of reference until you get the hang of all the different parts of a hook. The first pattern I'm going to talk about is a simple Chironomid pupa, or a buzzer is what we call them in the UK. Now with this, there's two core concepts. That is just a body and a thorax. You might get some patterns that have ribs on them or ribbing and some cheeks and wing buds, but essentially the two core components are going to be body and thorax. Now with this particular pattern, with these type of pupa patterns, I would always recommend have 1/3 of the thorax is the overall length of the actual pattern. At an absolute push, always, if anything, err on the side of less on the thorax side of things. So there's no harm in having less of a thorax and more body section, because when you look at some of these patterns or you look at some of the real life bugs, there are some out there that do have that little bit of a shorter thorax and a longer body. This pattern is just a nice, simple lure. It's a woolly bugger, and it's a great example of a simple lure or streamer. It's just got a tail, a body, a head section, and it's also got some body hackle too. You might find that some patterns would have some ribbing in them, although with this you can't actually see that because I've used some black thread for the ribbing, so I didn't highlight that in this picture. When it comes to proportions, the tail is something that you can have a little bit of artistic license, I suppose. Make a nice longer tail, it will impart more movement, but you then also run the risk of the fish nipping at the tail and not necessarily getting a hook up. That's something you can do a little bit of experimenting and see what you prefer. Looking at this next pattern, there's a bit more going on here. There's a tail, a body, a thorax, and a head section. The head section is quite often overlooked because a lot of people just look at it as, well, that's where I finish up the fly pattern and varnish the head and that's it, we're done. But strictly speaking, it is actually part of the pattern itself. Now you could also have ribbing and legs with these type of patterns too. So a little bit more going on with this pattern compared to that simple Chironomid pupa. Usually with this type of pattern, I would always stick to the 1/3, 2/3 rule. So 1/3 of the overall hook shank for the thorax and then 2/3 of the shank for the body. So it's the 1/3, 2/3, 2/3 rule. And then when you go into the tail, that will be the same length as the body. So again, 2/3 of the hook shank, and then the same for the legs. Strictly speaking, however, with the legs on this pattern, I do tie them a little bit longer, because when you actually look at some of the mayfly species, for example, the legs that are closest between the thorax section and the body, or the abdomen, are actually quite short, but because they set further back, that you kind of get this impression they're a little bit longer than they perhaps are. One thing you will notice with this is that gradual taper throughout the body into the thorax section, and then quite a lot larger thorax section, because if you think about the thorax section and a lot of the bugs that this looks to imitate, that's where their wings are developing underneath the exoskeleton. So the wings are developing underneath that. So inevitably they are going to be you can have a slightly wider thorax section. But as far as the kind of taper goes throughout the body, you're always looking to have a kind of a bit of a carrot shaped look to it. So you're going to go from thin to quite a lot thicker as you go up the hook shank towards the eye. Now, one thing I also want to point out is the ribbing. Ribbing is actually quite important because it does two things. It acts as a durability factor for a fly. So when you add ribbing in, you're often going in the opposite direction of the material. So it binds it in and just offers that extra durability. But it also then doubles up as segmentation. So when you look at a lot of the actual real bugs, they have a certain amount of segments to their bodies. So ribbing actually helps give the impression of segmentation. I don't personally like to overdo it. However, I would always err on the side of slightly less segmentation. I don't think the trout sit and count. I mean, I don't think that's something they do. What they might do, however, is look at the look at the movement of the fly and look at the life elements of it too. So when you look at a pheasant tail nymph, for example, there are small fibers in there that will move in the water, and that imparts an impression of life. And I think that's more important than having 7 or 8 or however many bits of segments you want in the actual pattern. Now, when you look at the proportions of a wet fly, I try and keep this pretty simple. I try and see everything from a hook shank perspective. So everything I tie, so when you look at the first section that I've drawn out, the body section is going to be a hook shank, the tail is going to be a hook shank, and then the top tail, if there is one, would also then be another hook shank beyond that. So I try and tie everything in a hook shank length, or half a hook shank length. So if I deviate from that, it might end up being a half a hook shank length. So if in that instance, if I was tying in a top tail and want it a little bit shorter, it'll be half a hook shank. Interestingly too, if you took a measurement from the tail to the top of the further fibers there, the top of the hackle fibers, that again is pretty much a hook shank length. Or when you look at the bend of the hook, it's 1.5 times a hook shank length. So you can kind of take those proportions and apply it to so many elements of a wet fly. So I always just try and look at it with that in mind. And then again, when I'm looking at tying in the ribbing in these patterns, I always look to try and replicate the width of the body. That is my kind of go-to, and it usually will give me a pretty good, nice looking separation between the wraps of ribbing. Same when you're looking at the proportions of a winged wet, you can again take into consideration that hook shank or 1.5 times a hook shank length, and you'll see it just marries up so often when you're doing things in that proportion. You'll see it kind of repeat itself. It's a very repeating pattern. When you look at the anatomy of an emerger, now we're just introducing a few different parts to it. So it's basically just a nymph that has a little bit more to it now, where we have a post and a hackle just to help suspend the pattern in the surface film of the water. Proportions always apply to everything, so I'd always try and stick to those proportions as much as possible, as close as possible. Again, I might deviate from it a little bit depending on the materials or what I'm using. It does vary a little bit depending on how good the hackle is I'm using and that sort of stuff, but I would always try and stick to roughly thereabouts. And then lastly, as we kind of work our way up to the surface now, we're looking at a dry fly, and then you have your hackle, wings, and tail, and the rest of it is pretty much the same. Now, when you look at the hackle, I would always try and stick to those measurements as a golden rule, so 1.5 times the gape of the hook, so you can see where the anatomy of a hook starts to really come into its own. This time the thorax is just simply covered in feathers, so it's still the same concept or still all the same measurements. That being said, I do tend to have a little bit of creative license when I come to tie the tail in. I would always tie a longer tail typically than the one length body section. I'll quite often go to the full length of the hook shank, sometimes even a little bit beyond that. But those are the proportions that I like to stick to as a tyer. I hope you found this video useful, and happy fly tying.